Hi, it's Ted Pattison again from the Power BI Cat team. Welcome to part 2 of the App Owns Data Starter Kit video series. In this video, we're going to look at setting up your development environment. In part 1, we looked at solution architecture. We looked at a lot of PowerPoint slides, talked about a lot of concepts, and now is when the rubber meets the road. We're going to actually go through the steps of setting up a development environment for Power BI development. Now, to set up our development environment properly, we have to go through 5 steps. First of all, we have to ensure that the Power BI environment that we have, is somewhere where I have the permissions that are required to configure the environment for what we need to do. Secondly, we're going to create an Azure AD security group named Power BI Apps. And then we're going to use that to configure tenant-level settings so that our service principal can call the Power BI REST API. Then we're going to create 2 Azure AD applications, one named AppOwnsDataService one named AppOwnsDataClient And from the part 1 video, we should have a pretty good idea what each one of those are for. Now, as far as creating or obtaining a Power BI development environment, there are a couple of requirements. First of all, you're going to need an Azure AD tenant where you have enough permissions to create new Azure AD security groups and Azure AD applications. We're going to have to configure some tenant level settings. So you will either have to be the global tenant admin of the Azure AD admin or the Azure AD tenant in which we're working, or you have to be a Power BI service administrator. Finally, the account that you're going to be using has to have a Power BI Pro license so we can get in to the Power BI admin portal and configure the things that we need to configure. Now, in our case right here, I'm going to create a brand new Power BI development environment, and I'm going to do it by creating a trial account of Office 365 E5 trial accounts. And this will give me an environment that I can create in 5 minutes and will be more than enough for us to be able to test the entire App Owns Data Starter Kit. So let's start by going to this particular link and creating a new trial account. So what we'll do is we'll follow this link and it'll bring us to a page where we can add information to create a new Microsoft account. And I'll put in my personal information. We'll skip over the part where I show you my phone number, but I get to create the name of the new tenant. And so I'm going to name mine, today's date is 0504, dev environment, dev env 0504. And, once we've created this environment, I should be able to go to the Microsoft 365 Admin Center and verify that, I have a new account and I am the global tenant admin, so I can do anything. Let's create one more account. And the reason I want to create this account for Austin is to show that, once you create a user account in Azure AD, you can add it to various roles. And so the roles that we're going to add it to is the Power BI Service Administrator role. And the idea of making a user, not the global tenant admin, but the Power BI Service Administrator is that that user can manipulate tenant level settings for Power BI. Okay, now that we've ensured that we have a Power BI development environment that will work for what we want to do, our first step now is to create the Power BI Apps group as a security group in Azure AD. Now, to create this Azure AD security group, we could use the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, but one of the things that is going to make it easier, especially when we create applications, is to use the portal of Azure AD. So portal.azure.com should get us to the Azure portal. Once we get to the Azure portal, we're not going to have a tour. Thank you very much. We're going to go down and we're going to go ahead and move to Azure Active Directory. And once we get there, we should be able to see this one particular tenant. Now, while we're here in Azure AD, I'm going to go to app registrations. Here's where we're going to add app registrations. And what I typically do is I add a Azure AD link so I can always get back to this location. But one thing I want to do beforehand is let's go down to properties. Because when you create a new test environment, after a couple days, there's obnoxious multi-factor authentication sets in. So if you want an environment that doesn't have those obnoxious prompts, I'm going to go down to Manage Security Defaults. Once again, this is Azure AD, then Properties, Manage Security Defaults, and we're going to basically turn those things off and say that, we're getting too many challenges inside there. And, once we've got that all set, now, let's move back to Azure AD. And so what I'm going to go to is groups. And once we get to groups, you'll see that Microsoft might have created a group or two as part of your tenant provisioning. Okay, so we're going to create a new group, and it's just going to be a security group, not a Microsoft 365 group. What is the group name? So we're going to call it Power BI Apps. This is my name. You can use a different name if you like, but this is the name, that we're using throughout the trial. So let's go ahead and choose create. And so now we've created this Power BI Apps group. And a little message, my group is successfully created. Okay, and now we can move ahead. Okay, now is the part where we have to move into the Power BI admin portal and configure 2 tenant-level settings in Power BI that allows the service principal to call the Power BI REST API. So first of all, we're going to navigate to Power BI and to the admin portal and then to tenant settings. And what we'll see is that there's one setting called Allow Service Principals to use Power BI APIs. If you don't have a Azure application in a security group that's configured here, you will not be able to call the Power BI APIs. And second, we also want to make sure that our service principal has the ability or the permissions to create new workspaces. So we're going to have to configure the workspace settings as well. Okay, enough talk. Let's do it. Okay, here we are. And I'm going to, first of all, let's just move to Power BI. So I'm going to type in app.powerbi.com. And that will just get me to the regular Power BI portal. If this is the first time you've logged in with an account, it might prompt you to log in. But now what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of all these different prompts here. And up in the very top menu, if I go down now to settings and now go down to admin portal, I can now navigate to the admin portal. Also note that you could go right there just by typing app.powerbi.com/admin portal. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to move to tenant settings. And once we get to tenant settings, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to scroll way down almost to the bottom until we get to developer settings. When we get to developer settings, there is this allow service principals to use Power BI APIs. So first of all, we're going to enable that. And note that we're going to put in a specific security group. You can open it up to the entire organization, but generally it's a much better practice for you now to come in here. And now we're going to search and find our group, Power BI Apps. We'll go ahead, click OK. And now that's configured. And now, secondly, after we've configured the allow service principals to use Power BIs, let's go up to the top. And when I get up to the top here, you're going to see that there is workspace settings. And for various reasons, workspace settings is not configured properly these days when a new tenant gets created. So what you need to do is you need to have a specific security group. And once again, we're going to use that same Power BI apps inside here. And now I'll go ahead and choose apply. And now we've configured our 2 tenant level settings. And so now what we'll see later on when we create an Azure AD application for our service principal, we just have to take that Azure application and put it into the Power BI apps group. Okay, so now we're on to creating the Azure AD applications we need for our solution. The first one is going to be named the AppOwnsData Service app. This app is what we're going to use to authenticate as a service principal so we can call the Power BI REST API with the platform as a service or the PaaS style of programming. Now, this application is going to be used by both AppOwnsDataAdmin and AppOwnsDataWebApi. So they both use the service principal behind this Azure AD application to be able to call the Power BI REST API. Now, along the way, when we record this, when we create this application, there's going to be data we need to record. Well, the GUID for the Azure AD tenant, the tenant ID, and the application has its ID called the client ID. And then there's also going to be an application password called a client secret. So what we're going to do is we're going to create the app, and then we're going to record the tenant ID, the client ID, and the client secret. And, just one point of reference, when you use Azure AD applications to authenticate a service principal, you can either use client secrets or client certificates. Client secrets are much easier because you can copy and paste them into your code. but they're not as secure. So client certificates are file-based and give you a much more robust security enforcement in production. And so what most people do is they use client secrets when they're developing or they're doing a proof of concept, and then they move to client certificates when they take their application and push it into production. So we're just going to use client secrets, throughout this demo. Okay, so it's time to create our new app. So let's go back to Azure AD and to the app registrations page. In the app registrations page, we're going to click on the new registration button. And here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new application. So this is going to be the AppOwnsData Service App. Now, for this application, we're going to say accounts in this organizational directory only. And just to be clear, the service principal app can only talk to the Power BI REST API, inside the same tenant. So the Power BI REST API does not support going across tenants for service principal access. Now down here, we're going to leave this setting to web because it's a confidential application. One other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a redirect URI, and this is not for the service principal. This is so a user can log into the AppOwnsData admin application. So let's go ahead and click on register. So at this point, we can see the summary page. And some things that we can see is here's the tenant ID, here's the client ID. And so as part of your setup, what we've recommended is you create a little text file. And so down here, I can go ahead and take the tenant ID, and I want to be able to record that. Okay, and now we're going to take the client ID, also known as the application ID. And we need the GUID for that. And then one more thing we need is the application's password that it uses to log in as service principal, what we call the client secret. And that's not going to be created, until you go through the steps to actually create it. So with our application back here, I'm going to go ahead and click in the left navigation on certificates and secrets. Once I do that, you can see that client secrets down below, there is a new client secret button. So I create a new client secret. I can, give any particular duration for when it expires. I can call it anything. I'll just call this, sec1 for secret one. Let's go ahead and choose add. And once you've done that, you have this one-time opportunity to take the value and to copy it. So let's take that, let's copy it, into the clipboard. And now what we have, is we have our key inside there, so there's all the information that we need, for an application to be able to authenticate, as service principal against this Azure AD application. Now, of course, running as service principal with this application, isn't going to work properly until we do one more thing. And I think you know what that is. So let's go back to groups. Let's go take our Power BI apps group. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill in and we're going to look at the membership. And there are no members. So any Azure AD application that I add into this group will automatically have permissions to call the Power BI REST API and to create new groups. There is the AppOwnsData Service App. So now we go ahead, select that. And so now we've been through the steps of not just creating the Azure AD application for our service principal, but also empowering it by adding it to this group. And this group has been configured, to allow service principals to call the API and to create new workspaces. And now that we have configured the AppOwnsData Service App, our last step is to configure the second Azure AD app for the client. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create an Azure AD application that users can authenticate with using any Microsoft organizational account or any Microsoft personal account. And so what's important to see is that this is the application that the AppOwnsData client will use to authenticate users, to basically acquire access tokens, and then to make secure calls by transmitting those calls, with the access token, in the authorization header. Now, let me once again point out that when you create your AppOwnsData embedding architecture, you don't have to use Azure AD as the identity provider for your client, but in this scenario, we're going to do it just because it's easier to not involve another identity system, as I'm trying to get so many people to get this demo up and running in their development environment. Now, one other thing that you're going to see is that if you do use Azure AD to secure a web API, as we are with the AppOwnsDataWebApi, you have to create at least one custom scope. Think of it as the ID for a particular permission. So after I create the application and record the client ID, I then have to go and create a custom scope. And that will, in fact, kind of give me this long string in the form of API : whack whack, and then the client ID for the application, whack, and then the name of the scope. And we're going to create the scope. We get to create what the name is. So reports.embed, is the name of the scope that we will be creating. Okay, enough talk. Let's do it. Well, you can see here in our dev environment that we've created the AppOwnsData Service app. So now it's time to create the AppOwnsData Client app. So when I create the AppOwnsData Client app, we're going to change the support account types. It's not just users, in my organization, but it's any user anywhere. And remember that we don't really carry the user's identity, into Power BI. The idea is I can authenticate any user, but then when we talk to Power BI, we'll be doing so as service principal. Now, for this client application, we're going to use the most modern and most secure way to secure a single page application. So Azure Directory has a new type of application called an SPA. Kind of the short story is it doesn't use implicit auth flow like SPAs have in the past. Instead, it has a key exchange and something that's closer to the authorization grant flow, but it's all embedded from the single page application. Now, one thing we will have to do is we will have to put in a redirect URL. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the redirect URL of https whack whack localhost 44301 whack, because that is the URL that we'll be using from Visual Studio. So this is kind of a dev time redirect URL. Now, once we create this new application, what we should see is that there's the application ID. Now, what's kind of interesting is let's grab the application ID. Let's go back to our configuration file. And for the application, where we had to authenticate as a service principal, you need the tenant ID, the client ID, and the client secret. You need the credentials so that you can authenticate a service principal. In the client application, all you really need, is the client ID. And that's what we're going to use to configure other applications. And then the one extra thing that I've already mentioned is that when we have an Azure AD application that is for a custom web API, you have to add a custom scope. So down here on the left, you can see there is an expose an API. And so what we need to do is we need to add a custom scope. And here it says add scope. Now, the first time you add a scope, it's going to tell you that you need to kind of create a string that's going to identify all the scopes. And so it proposes a string of API : whack whack and the client ID. So here we're just going to say save and continue. And so now it knows kind of the root part of the string. And now I create one or more scopes. And so the scope that I'm going to create is somewhat arbitrary. We get to give it whatever name we want. And the name I've chosen is going to be reports.embed. And once we've created that particular scope in here, make sure who can consent, which is going to be regular admin users. And then we have to put some information in each one of these text boxes. And because I want to go quickly here, I'll just put some blank text inside there, and we'll go ahead and click on add scope. And now we have created a scope inside here, and you can kind of see what the scope looks like. So ultimately, the client application and the web API have to know two things. They have to know the GUID of the client ID, and they have to basically know also the name of the scope, reports.embed, and both of the client application and the web API, already have been pre-configured, to expect the scope to be reports.embed. Well, look at that, how time flies. We've hit the end of part 2, where we set up a development environment for the AppOwnsData Starter Kit. Now, in part 3, we'll download the source code, open up in Visual Studio, and start configuring it so we can start testing the application out.